the third talk in a three-part series of talks on phylogenetics and language. First, we heard from Simon Greenhill and Fiona Jordan, and today we're going to hear from Tom Currie. Tom's got his PhD in evolutionary anthropology in 2009 from University College London. This included a visit to the lab of Russell Gray and Upland, the source of many great things philo-linguistical. He's then a postdoc at the Hasegawa Laboratory in Tokyo and did another postdoc at University College London. He has recently accepted a position as a lecturer at the University of Exeter in the UK. Today, Tom is going to tell us about connections between linguistic and biological worlds and similar challenges they face from non-tree-like evolution.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to give this talk, Eric, and I'll just explain a little bit about the title. Hopefully it will become apparent later in the talk, but I won't be talking too much about Bobbins. I'll be talking a little bit about Bayesian Inference, but not much, but I'm mainly going to be talking about borrowing. And the plan for this talk is to, first of all, do a kind of a quick recap on what Simon and Fiona have been talking about the last two seminars. Then I'll talk a little bit about some common objections raised to these approaches, and then primarily discussing borrowing and horizontal transfer, and then kind of asking three main questions. So, in cultural systems, does borrowing occur? How tree-like is cultural evolution? Then I'll be asking, well, if it does occur, does it matter? What effect does it have on our ability to use phylogenetic methods with cultural data? And then I'll go on to talk about how we deal with that based on the findings of those studies. And so I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about these kind of issues here and the simulation work I've done trying to address the effects of horizontal transmission on phylogenetic methods. So, background. So, tree thinking, as everybody listening to this will know, is kind of fundamental to evolutionary studies, going back all the way to Darwin and that original sketch he did and the origin of species, and perhaps even further back in time as well. And it's really kind of phylogenies and tree thinking is really kind of fundamental to a lot of work done in biology. Now, recently, and the reason I've been invited to give this talk is that people have begun to apply the same kinds of tree thinking and computational phylogenetic methods to investigate cultural evolution and linguistic evolution. So there's just a selection of papers and edited volumes that have come out over the last, I guess, 20 years or so, with probably a big increase in the last 5 or 6 years or so. And this is part of a broader movement to kind of apply evolutionary theory and methods from biology to address questions about human cultural evolution, kind of broadly defined, and human behavior. So this is just a kind of an example of some of the subfields in biology here that have kind of analogues in kind of modern cultural evolutionary studies. And in cultural phylogenetics, what we're trying to do is take the same phylogenetic thinking, the kind of macroevolutionary studies that are used in systematics and biogeography and even aspects of paleobiology, and applying them to cultural and linguistic traits. So just to kind of go over some basic stuff, in cultural phylogenetics, as in most applications of phylogenetics, there are kind of two main types of analysis we're talking about. And it's important to kind of distinguish between these because sometimes people get these confused, or kind of even people that should know better get confused between the two types of analysis, which are phylogenetic inference, that's tree building. That's where we try and construct phylogenetic trees showing the historical relationships between languages or elements of culture, and build these kind of phylogenetic trees. Using the same techniques that biologists use with genetic data or formally use with morphological data. And the other type of analysis are comparative methods, and that's where we take phylogenetic trees and we map other traits onto them, and we begin to try and work back in time and try and work out how those traits have changed over evolutionary history. And to do that, we can answer such questions as trying to reconstruct ancestral states of traits, look at sequences of change, look at coevolution, and look at kind of rates of change, how fast different traits are changing. And so Simon, in his talk a couple of months ago now, discussed mainly phylogenetic inference. So that's the idea of building these family trees. Is focused on language, of course. So this is kind of a noddy representation of the Indo-European language family. So we can see English is up here in the kind of the Germanic branches of the family, and then you've got Romance languages here, which are all descended from Latin. And these languages, these Indo-European languages, go back in time to a Proto-Indo-European language spoken, so they tell us, somewhere in Anatolia about 9,000 years ago. And Simon talked about his work, his great work that he's done with specifically with Austronesian languages of islands Southeast Asia and the Pacific, constructing these phylogenies of 400 different languages based on data collected of basic vocabulary data, which is kind of lists of 200 words describing basic elements of vocabulary, which are then compared across languages for similarities, and using phylogenetic methods, those data are used to build phylogenetic trees. And then Fiona last month talked about the use of comparative methods, particularly in cultural evolutionary studies. This is where we take those kind of phylogenetic trees that Simon built, and we map other traits onto the tips of the trees and begin to work back in time to look at how those traits have changed. So this is a study I did a few years ago, looking at the evolution of political complexity in Austronesian. And here I wanted to test between different models of how political complexity changes over time. And there are a number of different studies, types of questions that can be answered with this approach. So that's the general background to cultural phylogenetics. Now, whenever I give a talk about this stuff, and probably whenever most of us give a talk about this stuff, we always get this kind of response. But first person always raising their hand, asking a question, normally asks, but what about all the problems associated with this? Cultural evolution and biological evolution are fundamentally different. You can't do this, right? So some of those objections are from people who are, shall we say, not scientific or aren't au fait with cross-cultural scientific studies, and kind of resist the idea of trying to reduce elements of culture and trying to make discrete elements and then analyze them systematically. But other critiques also come from people who are completely okay with that, but the main problem they come up with is the idea that actually horizontal transmission or borrowing between cultures or languages is something that's kind of really widespread and doesn't fit with the idea of a kind of a tree-based model of evolution which assumes purely vertical inheritance. And this kind of objection can be summed up in this quote by Stephen Jay Gould, who here in this quotation taken from his 87 book, An Action in the Storm, talks about how human cultural evolution proceeds along paths outstandingly different from the ways of genetic change. Trees are correct topologies of biological evolution. In human cultural evolution, on the other hand, transmission and anastomosis, that's blending, are rampant. 5 minutes with a wheel, a snowshoe, a bobbin, or a bow and arrow may allow an artisan of one culture to capture a major achievement of another. So this is where the bobbin of my title comes in. And so here Gould's saying that basically biological and cultural evolution are really different. And evolutionary trees are a correct way of thinking about biological evolution, but they're not good for human cultural evolution. Now, what I want to say in this talk is, first of all, we know that not everything about biological evolution is nice and tree-like, and I'll come back to that later on. But here I want to focus on whether human cultural evolution is tree-like at all, and kind of the extent to which borrowing and horizontal transmission occurs in cultural systems. And this kind of dichotomy between kind of a nice purely branching mode of evolution, which is supposed to represent biological evolution, is represented in this kind of famous picture here by the work of Alfred Kroeber, contrasted with the kind of the blending, entangled mess that is supposedly cultural evolution. Now, one of the reasons I think that a lot of people do kind of think that, or are skeptical about tree models of language or culture, is when we think about the language we're speaking now, language spoken throughout the world, English. And English is mad, right? The history of English. It's, it started off, or Britain was originally inhabited by Celtic speakers. Then the Romans came in, bringing in Latin with that. And then English doesn't actually get started until the Anglo-Saxons come in. And then, so they kind of lay their language on top of kind of the original inhabitants of the language, and then the Vikings come in and they do various things and they bring in their language. And so there was even a line in the across England where Danish was more widely spoken than English at one point. Then the Normans come in, bringing French, so if you think about words like we use the word pig for the animal, and then pork for the meat. So that comes from Norman influences and Norman French, and the kind of social stratification that came in with that. And then later on, we even have the Renaissance and kind of even more influences from Latin and classical Greek and French and Italian. And then other parts of the Middle East come in, and then we went out and conquered the world and started colonizing everywhere and bringing in all the other kinds of words from different languages into English. And it's estimated that around 60% of the English vocabulary is actually not of Anglo-Saxon origin. I mean, if you think about as well, the topic of today's talk is phylogenetics, which is obviously, again, a Greek word. So, is English weird? Is English the exception or the rule? So the first thing to say about that is probably actually English is a little bit kind of extreme in terms of the amount of influences from other languages because of our history of kind of being invaded by everybody continuously over 2,000 years, and also going out and having contact with other societies and bringing in those words. But an interesting thing to note is actually that most phylogenetic studies are based on items or lists of basic vocabulary. So these are lists of kind of 200 words that people use fairly regularly. And when we look at those kind of lists of basic vocabulary, actually about 85% of that is derived from Anglo-Saxon. And in spoken language, in the words we kind of use every day, around 80% of everyday English in conversations and kind of non-academic or non-official uses, 80% of English used is of Anglo-Saxon origin. And there's that famous anecdote about Churchill's "We will fight them on the beaches" speech, which is made up, or that section of the speech is made up completely of words of Anglo-Saxon origin and only contains one word of French origin, which is, of course, surrender. So, so the thing to take away from that is that elements of language, and what we're trying to do when we look at these basic vocabulary lists, is trying to get at kind of the deep history of languages, and these lists seem to be more immune to borrowing than perhaps other parts of language. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about some studies that have looked at the levels of borrowing in languages and trying to get an idea about how tree-like is cultural evolution. Okay, so recently a paper by Bowen and colleagues published in PLOS ONE tried to look at kind of the levels of borrowed words in these basic vocabulary lists. And their main focus was on looking to see whether there are systematic differences between hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists in these levels of borrowings or loan words, but they also examined word lists from kind of a comprehensive study of loans from around the world. And what they found was that they're comparing these 200 word lists and looking to identify how many of those words in those words lists are borrowed from other languages. And so these are the results from the study. So these different colours here represent kind of different regions. So that's South America, Australia, North America, and all of those combined. And then this walled line here is kind of a representative sample of all languages, or a representative sample of languages from around the world. And so what we see is that in most languages, only about 5 to 10% of words in these basic vocabulary lists are actually borrowed from other languages. So 95% of words seem to be being transmitted vertically from one generation to the next. And then these plots speak to this point about whether there are systematic differences here between hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists. And so their conclusion was that actually there are similar processes or similar levels of borrowing between hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists. Australia seems to show quite high levels of borrowing between different languages, but there's no comparison there because there were no original kind of agricultural languages in Australia. But what that shows, kind of the takeaway point for this talk, is that actually levels of borrowing, at least when we look at basic vocabulary, can actually be quite low. And then a few years ago, a study by Collard, Shannon, and Tarani looked at this question of how tree-like cultural evolution is. And what they wanted to do was to say, okay, if we compare 21 biological data sets and 21 cultural data sets, and if we analyze them using phylogenetic inference package or a technique known as maximum parsimony, which most people will be familiar with, do we see a big difference in the fit of a tree model to cultural data sets compared with biological data sets? And then what they found was that there was actually very little difference in measures of goodness of fit. And so here they're using a reticulation index, which kind of shows how many steps away from a kind of a perfect phylogenetic model you have to take in order to reconcile your data. So here's the biological data sets that they analyzed. So they found average reticulation index, which goes from 0 to 1. So an average of 0.61, minimum of 0.35, maximum 0.94. And actually similar values when they looked at the cultural data sets. So similar means, similar minimum, slightly lower maximum, but probably nothing too different. Now that doesn't mean that necessarily the same reasons affecting retention index, reticulation index, also retention index, in the biological data sets are the same as in the cultural, but at least it shows that if we're going to use phylogenetic methods with biological data, we can at least use them with cultural data as well. So, the main part of the talk that I'm going to spend time in is addressing this question. So, okay, so there's reason to think that cultural evolution might be have tree-like aspects to it, but we do know that horizontal transmission and borrowing occurs, right? So, what should we do about it? Now, what we shouldn't do is this. We shouldn't just stick our heads in the sand, pretend borrowing doesn't occur, or that that we should just not do cultural phylogenetics at all. Instead, what we need to do is to understand what effect borrowing has on the methods that we use. And we need to see how sensitive are these techniques to violations of this assumption of purely vertical inheritance. Are there some situations where things break down and others where there's no problem? And so my contribution to answering these questions come from a couple of papers that I did during my PhD, where along with Simon Greenhill and Russell Gray in one paper and Ruth Mason in another, we used simulation techniques to simulate the effects of horizontal transmission and then see how well we could get back the real answer using phylogenetic methods. So the first study was this one, which looks at the question of phylogenetic inference. And then the second one looks at the question of phylogenetic comparative methods. So, phylogenetic inference. What we did, so the basic approach was that we start with a known phylogeny, that's our kind of input tree, and then we simulate data over the phylogeny under various levels of borrowing horizontal transmission. Then we take those simulated data sets and we analyze them using phylogenetic methods, and we see how well we can get back the true tree. And we compare these results to those that are simulated without borrowing, so that we've got a baseline to know kind of how much of the error is there due to this kind of the difficulty of conducting phylogenetic inference at all, versus the kind of the unique effect of horizontal transmission. And so in this study, we kind of examined two aspects of accuracy. We looked at the topology, so that's the how well do our reconstructed trees match our input tree, our true phylogeny. And then we also looked at questions related to timing. So that was particularly motivated by a paper by Gray and Atkinson from 2003, which reconstructed the date of Proto-Indo-European to about 9,000 years ago, and a date that kind of a lot of linguists questioned. So we were particularly interested to see whether borrowing might have led to errors in that timing assessment. And so the simulation took place by invoking a model, a stochastic Dollo model of trait evolution. And what that means is that we have a model whereby traits, which are representing our linguistic data, they can arise only once. That's the Dollo part of the model. And so to go through an example here, so this is kind of the root of our tree, the beginning of the simulation. You start with a trait, which represents a cognate for the linguistic data. And you go along through time, and then another trait is born. You go along, and then there's a splitting, a divergence event, where the language is split into two. Those traits are inherited by the daughter languages. And then in this lineage, a third trait is born. You go along, and then here you have an event where trait number one is lost in this language, dies out, that word is not used anymore. Carry on, and here you have a borrowing event. So this language borrows this trait number 3 into this lineage, and that gets inherited along through time. Go along here as well, we have another splitting event. We go along here, again we have another trait being born, borrowing event into the other lineage. Here trait number 2 dies out, is no longer born. So we get to the end. And so at the end of our simulation, lineage A has traits number 3 and 4. Lineage B has traits 2, 3, and 4. And lineage C has traits 1, 2, and 3. And those get represented as binary data, the presence or absence of those traits. So this is trait 1, this is trait 2, present in these two languages, trait 3, present in all of them, and then trait 4, just present in these two. So this is simulating the same kind of data that is used in the linguistic studies. And this kind of model where traits can only arise once is thought to be a pretty good approximation of what we think is happening in the language data, where cognates, kind of these words that share a common origin, tend to get invented only once, or that particular word for a particular meaning gets you don't get kind of convergent evolution a lot. So that's the basic model of language evolution that we're using to simulate. And then we took 2 input trees, and we wanted to have a quick look, or see if we can see whether there are any differences based on the kind of the tree shape that we put in and simulate data over. So our first input tree is this kind of balanced phylogeny, with kind of, a nice even number of branches and splitting nicely kind of constantly over time. And we compared that with a chain topology, which kind of groups tend to split sequentially through time. So the other thing to note about that is that when we were doing the timing studies, we also put in constraints for our analysis, because that's what you have to do in order to get time trees from linguistic data. And I can talk about that a bit more if you have a question about that later. But at the moment, so the basic idea is we're taking these input trees, we're simulating data over them, generating simulated data that we're going to analyze at the end. And then we have 3 borrowing scenarios. So in the first scenario, if you've got, let's say we're at this point in time, in this lineage, that means that this lineage can borrow a word from any other lineage, any other contemporary lineage. Okay? There's no restriction. Then we have 2 local borrowing scenarios. The first one is there's a limit, so you have to share a common ancestor within 3,000 years. So that's represented by this light blue square here. So that means that if you go back 3,000 years, so anything that shares a common ancestor with this lineage, so any of these guys, anything back to here, any of these guys, that means anybody here can borrow from anybody else at this point in time. And then a more restrictive local borrowing scenario where you have to share a common ancestor within 1,000. So that means that is restricted to only these guys here because they share a common ancestor at this point within the 1,000 years. And so that's to kind of approximate the idea that borrowing is constrained, at least geographically, and that's going to be pretty similar to it being constrained to close phylogenetic neighbors as well. Okay. So these were the results. So first of all, we looked at topology, and what we did was under varying levels of borrowing. So so here we have no borrowing. Up to here we have 50% of the lexicon gets borrowed over a 1,000-year period. We simulated the data, and then we try and reconstruct the trees using the same model of evolution, using Bayesian method in a program called TraitLab. And then we compare the topologies of our simulated data, or the trees built using our simulated data, with our input tree. And so on this axis here, we have quartet distance, so that's a measure of how similar the different tree topologies are. And then this line up here is kind of the baseline. If you compare a completely random tree of the same number of tips, it's completely randomized, then that's the kind of level of similarity you would expect. Down here, so 0 would be completely the same. So what we see is that under the local borrowing scenario, the most constrained borrowing scenario, is that the topologies of the simulated data, or the reconstructions of the simulated data, basically are exactly the same as the input trees under all the borrowing levels. When we relax the constraints on borrowing a bit, then interestingly under the balance tree still, there's no great effect of borrowing even at these extreme levels. In the more chained topology, then as borrowing increases, then we start to get the topology of the trees built using the simulated data start to kind of break down and start to become a bit more random. And then this begins to break down quite a lot more under the global borrowing scenario. But it's still not completely random. Hello? Yeah.
I was just curious, what about the branch length distribution between the local and the balanced ones? Just glancing at it, it looked like maybe the internal branches were shorter for the chain topology versus the balanced one.
Yes. Yeah. So Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to say a bit about this at the end, but it's not necessarily, the difference here is not necessarily a general finding between differences between balance and change, so it may well be kind of specifically about these kind of issues of branch lengths. But shall I come back to that? And then, so that was the topology, and then the timing. So the timing issue here is that, so again, here on this age we've got the mean estimated age. So this line here, the dotted line represents the date of the true trees. And so what we're seeing is, again, as borrowing increases, under the local borrowing scenario, we're not getting much disturbance from the true levels, from the kind of the true estimate. Starts to break down a bit more under the less restricted borrowing, and then under the kind of the global scenario, that's when we start to kind of see a drop off. And what's interesting, what's happening is there's a bias here in the effects of borrowing on these date estimates. And what's happening is that borrowing is bringing forward the dates, so we're estimating the dates of divergence as more recent than they really are. And that's of relevance to that Indo-European question that I talked about, where the kind of the inferred date from the phylogenetic analysis of Gray and Atkinson was 9,000 years ago. And a lot of linguists argue that actually the divergence date is much more recent, about 6,000 years ago. And they argue that things like borrowing might have affected those analyses. But what this is showing is that if borrowing has affected those dating estimates, then Indo-European might be actually even older than 9,000 years ago. That's if it has affected things. So so that's a kind of an interesting and a good thing to know, is the kind of the direction of bias that borrowing introduces into that. So the kind of the conclusions from that those analyses are that the kind of the accurate recovery of the true topology is not affected much by local borrowing, and that borrowing can affect estimates of time depth, but it's biased towards bringing more recent inferred time depths. The kind of the chain topology is more affected than the balance one, but we don't know whether that's a kind of a general finding about kind of tree shape, or whether that's, as I say, something that might be just kind of going on with the kind of the particular branch lengths here. So here, for example, you've got much kind of shorter branch lengths, which might allow kind of more widespread borrowing under that kind of 1,000 year time constraint than here when you have branch lengths that are a bit more spread out. I guess is that what you were getting at with the question?
Yeah, and also that when you have longer branches, there's sort of longer time for things to diverge from one another.
I mean here, yes, yeah. So that's certainly a possibility. So what we would need to do to kind of get at those is have a wider range of input topologies and kind of vary those more systematically. One of the constraints with this analysis is that it took kind of a long time to reconstruct the simulated data, because we used the same kind of Bayesian methods to reconstruct the trees. So that means very long runs for each simulation. So these are kind of just single simulations for each parameter level. And at certain ones we did kind of we did 5 simulations for this level and 5 simulations for this level to kind of get an idea about variation. But this kind of global borrowing scenario is probably quite unrealistic in terms of, certainly for something like Austronesian. It's very unlikely that New Zealand Maori were able to kind of borrow from native languages in Taiwan, for example. So overall, their estimates, at least under kind of restricted levels of borrowing, seem to be, borrowing analyses are pretty robust to borrowing, and we kind of think that's a lot to do with a kind of a ratio of signal to noise. Whereas, so if there's no kind of direction to the borrowing, then basically all it's doing is introducing noise, and as long as you've got enough signal, then you should be able to recover the true tree. Okay, so the next part looks at phylogenetic comparative methods, and this was motivated by a study in 2006 by Charlie Nunn and colleagues, who simulated borrowing with cultural traits and then used independent contrast to see whether those methods were affected by borrowing. And so in this approach is a bit more spatially explicit, so they simulate population history on a grid. So kind of cultures move through the grid, diversify, go extinct, and then other cultures inhabit these grid cells. You get one society per grid cell, and these cultures have 2 continuous traits that change over time. And then we allow borrowing of traits between adjacent grid cells, and then we analyze simulated data using comparative methods. And again, we compare the results of the data sets without borrowing to those where borrowing has occurred. And we're comparing 2 aspects of accuracy, so error rates in assessing whether traits are really correlated or not, and then ancestral state reconstruction. And then these 2 trees just illustrate the kinds of topologies. So this one happens when there's a kind of a high extinction rate, and then this one when there's a low extinction rate. So we were a bit skeptical about some of the findings from the Nunn et al. Study, so we wanted to look at them, and we looked first of all at how horizontal transmission occurs. Do the traits get passed horizontally together or separately? Nunn and colleagues only looked at the case where traits get passed together, and they're linked. And then we looked at other lower levels of horizontal transmission, and then we looked at just the effect of analyzing larger numbers of cultures. So just increasing power, basically. So these are some of the results we got when we simulated data, continuous traits, without correlation between them. And then we analyze them using phylogenetic generalized least squares and ordinary regression to see whether they're correlated or not. And I'll concentrate on these results here. They're kind of a bit clearer. So what we have here, on this axis, we've got the proportion of times we find significant correlations between the traits. And then along here, we've got kind of increasing borrowing levels. And these are non-phylogenetic analyses, and the black dots represent phylogenetic analysis. So what we find is that if traits are not linked when they're borrowed, if we run just ordinary least squares regression, then we kind of about half the time we find false positives in terms of we think the traits are really correlated when actually they're not. But actually when we use phylogenetic comparative methods, we get error rates that are about as acceptable as you can get. So this is a 5% error rate. And that seems to be unaffected by unpaired borrowing. But in contrast to that, if we have traits linked when they're borrowed, so they get borrowed together as a pair, then even the phylogenetic method starts to get increasing levels of error with increasing horizontal transmission. Now, if we contrast that with the situation, if we simulate data that's correlated, what happens if the traits are unlinked when they're borrowed is that at low levels of horizontal transmission, both methods say that the traits are linked, but then that breaks down as more horizontal transmission you get. But if both traits are linked at horizontal transmission, then that doesn't affect the inference, correct inference that the traits are evolving together. So what's happening here is that in this case where the traits are linked at horizontal transmission, those traits are evolving together and they're not getting separated by horizontal transmission. So both types of analysis are kind of correctly saying that they're evolving together because they're not getting disrupted. But here, over time, over increasing levels of horizontal transmission, the linkage between those traits gets disrupted as they don't spend enough time evolving together. Do you have any questions about those analyses?
Makes sense to me.
Yep, good. And then I'll quickly talk about the ancestral states. So basically, we looked at how closely the estimates of ancestral states were to the input level, and the main thing that seems to affect ancestral states here is not so much borrowing, but extinction rate and the shape of the trees. So if you have those trees with really long branches and much of the divergence occurs near the base, then you're much more likely to be able to get results that are more accurate. There doesn't seem to be kind of a systematic pattern or bias in terms of accuracy with reconstructing ancestral states, but the variance you get with those studies increases. So the conclusion from that study is that borrowing doesn't necessarily lead to problems, but the type of borrowing has important implications.
Sorry, I bungled up the buttons a little bit. But one quick question: when you were doing your comparative methods, were you using the simulated tree that was, or the original tree that you're simulating data on, or were you using data, or were you using a tree that you reconstructed from the data?
No, we used the original population history, simulated population history tree. So we're not doing that extra step of reconstructing the trees at this point. That would have been kind of a step too far. So obviously when you add in the realities of, first of all, the error introduced in trying to reconstruct the tree, and then the extra error of doing the comparative analyses, that's kind of makes it more difficult to interpret. Okay, so here, yeah, so basically, if you get linked borrowing and real correlation, you're okay. If you've got linked borrowing but no real correlation, you're in trouble as well. Unlinked borrowing and real correlation, but then unlinked borrowing, no correlation, again, you're okay. So, so kind of the question we can ask is actually would traits that are not correlated be consistently borrowed together? So if not, then borrowing's not going to be too much of a problem in terms of kind of increasing false positives or false negatives. If you look at the inverse of that. Okay, so I realize I'm kind of getting low on time here, so just from those simulation studies, kind of one of the things that came out is, you know, borrowing isn't just kind of one thing. There's kind of many different types of borrowing. The studies we were doing kind of assume this kind of model of borrowing where things kind of happen at a kind of constant rate all over the place. But it'd be interesting to look at cases where you get a kind of more systematic or kind of directed borrowing at certain, and that could have reflect some kind of uptake of a particular kind of innovation. For example, kind of horses in the New World or something like that. Just finally, I'll just talk briefly about, so what do we do with that? Well, we have to deal with it. And one of the things we can do is trying to understand how borrowing can affect our results. We can do things like removing known borrowings from analyses, see how that affects inferences. So that's some of the things that I've done in comparative analyses before. And generally the findings I've had that things are quite robust. So I won't talk too much about that. The other point to make is that, you know, horizontal hybridization occurs in biological evolution, but biologists have not just kind of abandoned phylogenetic methods and kind of gone, have not just given up. They can be used. So we can use phylogenetic methods to investigate borrowing, and we can try and develop new methods that incorporate borrowing. So just quickly about biological evolution, this is an example of a recent paper published in Nature that I think is a really nice example of using phylogenetic methods to look at that don't kind of that take advantage of kind of horizontal transmission to kind of tell us more about biological evolution. So these are butterflies from South America, and these guys here are mimics of these species. And what these guys found was that if you look at the whole genome, this is the species tree here, which is kind of represented by most of the genome. But if you look at certain parts of the genome, what you find is that the mimic species start to cluster with the species they're trying to mimic. So here and here, and that occurs in these parts of the genome, and that's evidence of hybridization, kind of introgression going on there. That's kind of an adaptive process. But again, it's phylogenetics that tells us that that's what's going on. Example, so Simon talked a lot about this in his talk. So we can use phylogenetic networks, which don't represent things as trees, but so kind of show the conflicting signal in the data. And so we can use these kind of, so these are data built with grammatical features of language. And sometimes, so some of this conflicting signal might be to do with convergent evolution, but it can also be to do with borrowing or likely borrowing. So for example, Finnish is getting kind of drawn into these Indo-European languages here. Hindi, which is an Indo-European language, is kind of clustering with a close geographical neighbor, but one that's not thought to be historically related. Other things we can do are these kind of co-phylogeny approaches, where we, if we know our kind of population history, we can build other phylogenies. So here, Jamie Tarani and colleagues use these methods to look at borrowing of Iranian tribal material textile things, rugs, like he's got here. And so what they did was they know the population history, so that's their dependent phylogeny, and then they can look and build trees of the tribal rugs and kind of see how many borrowing events or other sorting events or codivergence events that you need to reconcile those trees. So trees that co-phylogenies that don't have any borrowing aren't good fits to the data, but if you have kind of two events, either two borrowing events or one borrowing event and then one extinction event, then that produces better fits to the data. And then finally, this study by Nelson Sati and colleagues who looked at trying to detect undiscovered borrowings in Indo-European here, and they take a network approach. And again, similar idea, they try and work out how many borrowing events you need in order to generate the kind of data we see in Indo-European. And one of the ways they assess that is working out kind of what would be the inferred size of ancestral vocabularies based on different levels of borrowing. So kind of it's kind of an anchor point to working out realistically how many borrowing events you need in order to generate these data. And I think they gave numbers on the order of about 8% of words in these basic vocabulary lists contained unknown borrowings. So to summarize that, borrowing is not necessarily fatal for phylogenetic methods. We do need more information about how borrowing occurs, how much it occurs, and what effect different forms of borrowing have. And we can use phylogenetic methods to investigate borrowing. And one thing I'd say is that, so borrowing is an issue, but what we need are systematic approaches to studying cultural and linguistic evolution. What we shouldn't do is just kind of, when we come up against these issues, come up against these problems, is kind of stop. That's what happened in the history of anthropology and linguistics. So, for example, in linguistics in the 1950s, people first kind of started playing with distance-based methods of tree building, and that was shown to be affected by non-constant rates of language evolution. So a lot of linguists just stopped using those methods rather than trying to build on them and trying to improve them. So although these methods aren't necessarily perfect, I think the take-home message is that they're a systematic way of looking at cultural and linguistic evolution, and that gives us a basis to build on the insights from these studies and to hopefully progress our understanding. So let's not throw out the phylogenetics baby with the borrowing bathwater.